that's not exactly what I want to talk about, answer those questions. What I want to talk about is where I am and what I see from my point of view, where I am and what I think needs to be done. I'm speaking of the Christian Bible. That's my focus. No exclusion is intended by that. It's simply a question of responsibility. And the title is Believers, Scholars. I have lived my life on that comma. As a believer, as a Christian, and as a scholar. And I try not to let either ruin the other. I see three things with regard to the Christian Bible, which after all we have done, are still profoundly yet to be done. But I couldn't, of course, have got to this point without the work that was already done. The first question is this. It has to do with the unity of the Christian Bible. I think we need a theology of the Christian Bible. And hasn't that been done, you might say? Negatively, it's not adequate any longer to repeat that libel, which I still hear, that the Old Testament is the good cop God. Excuse me, is the bad cop God, the God of vengeance and violence, but the New Testament is the good cop God of love and mercy. That'll only work if you don't make the mistake of ever reading the Bible, especially if you get to the book of Revelation, which is probably the most violent book in the canonical literature of all the world's great religions. Relentlessly, I mean, from one end to the other. So, what's the unity of this text? What theology holds it together? Is the Old Testament simply a quarry for either prophecies that nobody understood till Jesus came along and everyone then understood them, or at worst for proof text afterwards to batter Jews who didn't agree that Jesus was the Messiah? What is the unity of the Bible? And it's not enough for me, at least, to say, though it is absolutely accurate, Jesus was a Jew. Of course. And I also, when I'm on that subject, reject completely the game that's played very often. My Jesus is more Jewish than your Jesus. Of course Jesus was a Jew, but what type of Jew? So my first problem of unfinished business, hugely unfinished business, is the theology of the Christian Bible. An adequate theology that takes its unity seriously. Coming out of that, the second one. Whether you're imagining the God of the Bible as a supreme being or as the supremacy of being, are you imagining this God as violent or non-violent? Or as some sort of a transcendental cocktail of so many parts violence and so many parts non-violence that you mix according to your denominational tradition or theological preference? If you go to the Bible, and I'm always talking from one end to the other, in the Christian Bible, is God violent? And if you say, well, there's all these texts that answer, of course, and we all know them, and there's all these texts that say the opposite. Is this God a God of non-violent distributive justice, or of violent retributive justice, or some mixture of them both? How do we answer that question? They're both there. And it is, for me at least, at the heart of that problem of the unity of the Bible and the theology that must still be written of the Christian Bible. What I personally see everywhere I look, from one end to the other, is every time we get a radical transcendental suggestion, the Bible, I mean the Bible, one end to the other, both asserts it and subverts it. Oh, we are good at that. If you read the book of Leviticus, which all Christians read regularly, and chapter 25, God says, the land belongs to me. You're all tenant farmers and resident aliens. And of course, the normalcy of civilization. Ordinary people, not bad people. Ordinary people say, then how do I keep mine and get yours? Which is the function of civilization. Well, how about loans and foreclosures? So as I read the Torah, it's trying relentlessly to be one step ahead of us. Not of them, but of us. And I can take it all the way to Paul's letters, and I see the same process. If Paul tells Philemon, or however you wish to pronounce it, that no, you are a Christian, and unfortunately, Onesimus is now a Christian, so a Christian master cannot have a Christian slave. Of course, we will find that in the New Testament, and then we will have Ephesians and Colossians and the house rules there, which will take care of it. And they will tell us very nicely that of course they will take for granted Christian masters and mistresses can have slaves, but they should treat them fairly. They will take it for granted. And then of course you get to Jesus. This is the one the Christian Bible has serious problems with. And when I say Jesus, I mean the historical Jesus. And when I say the historical Jesus, I do not mean some person different from what believers call the incarnate Christ. It is the same person whom Peter says you are the Christ, and Pilate says you are the criminal. They're not two people. They're two viewpoints, two interpretations, two acts of faith. Pilate does not lack faith. He has not Christian faith. He has what we might call Roman faith. So everywhere I look, I find a vision of non-violent justice, which is both asserted, in this case, incarnated, lived out, embodied, and then almost immediately is being subverted. If I look at Matthew's Gospel, I don't have to go all the way even to the book of Revelation. If I look at Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, Jesus is saying not only should you love your enemies, but you shouldn't call them names. You shouldn't call them names. But by chapter 23, Jesus is doing a very good job of calling the Pharisees hypocrites, 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 blind hypocrites, and brood of vipers and hypocrites, which probably doesn't sound like a compliment. Now the question I have to ask, has Jesus changed his mind, or has Matthew changed his Jesus? Does Jesus just lose his temper, or is Matthew losing his vision? So everywhere I look, I'm beginning to find this pattern, from one end to the other. It's not all in one part. A vision, a transcendental vision of non-violent distributive justice, which is always asserted. This is the glory of the Bible. Nobody really got to clean it up for once and for all. So that's there, but then it's going to be subverted. One way or another we get around it. And that brings me to my final point. We call it the Christian Bible. If we are Christians, we talk about Christianity. Christianity. Does the Bible judge Jesus, or does Jesus judge the Bible? Which is the norm? Which is the criteria? Is Jesus the criteria? When I say that, I mean the historical Jesus. The Jesus who rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and possibly even on a nursing donkey, to fulfill, of course, Zachary, but also to lampoon Pilate. This Jesus who's coming back on a war horse, on a battle charger in the book of Revelation. Is Jesus the norm of the Bible, or is the Bible the norm of Jesus? Are we the people, talking now to Christians as a Christian, are we Christians the people of the book, or are we simply the people with the book, but the people of the person? I noticed that John's Gospel does not say God so loved the world that he sent us a book. I I noticed that we count time when we Christians got to do it for everyone. We counted time down to the historical Jesus and up from the historical Jesus. It's almost as if this Christian Bible, which is a small library put together to look like a book and then presented as a story. But the meaning of this story is in the middle, which is no way to tell a story. When you want to understand a story, you go to the end, right? So maybe this is a weird story whose climax is in the center, whose meaning is in the middle. So the great unfinished business for me with the Christian Bible is whether what Christians call the incarnation, and which I call the historical Jesus, and I'm talking about the same thing from different points of view. Is that the center of the Bible and the norm of the Bible? And did evangelicals get it precisely right when they said WWJD? What would Jesus do? They didn't say WDBS. What does the Bible say? So the great unfinished business for me, those are my points. What is the unity of the Christian Bible? For Christians and for scholars of the Christian Bible. What about the violence and the non-violence in the Bible? And is Jesus the norm of the Bible, or is the Bible the norm of Jesus? Thank you.
Our second panelist is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has served as president of the Southeast region of the SBL, chair of the New Testament Textual Criticism section of the Society, and book review editor of the Journal of Biblical Literature. The author of more than 20 books, including the bestsellers Misquoting Jesus, God's Problem, Jesus Interrupted, and Forged. He is currently at work on a forthcoming scholarly edition by Forgery in the New Testament and a popular critique of the mythicist argument in his next book, Did Jesus Exist?, to be published in March. Please welcome Harper.
Well, I'm trying to imagine two responses to Roger's questions that would be more different than Dom's and mine, but I can't. Let me start with two scenarios. One of my first SBL meetings was in 1986. I attended the textual criticism section and witnessed 8 people in the section, that was all that was in the section, arguing over arcane and for the most part irrelevant textual trivia. 25 years later, last month, there was a debate on textual criticism at SMU with me and Dan Wallace. They sold tickets at $20 a pop, and they sold 1,500 tickets. Something has changed. We live in a different world today than the one 25 years ago. One difference is that a lot more people in the general public have come to realize that the Greek manuscript tradition of the New Testament actually matters for something. Textual criticism, as you may have noticed, is the most arcane subfield within biblical studies and is widely seen as completely and hopelessly boring. But in fact, it can be made interesting and relevant. This is what drove me to write the book, Misquoting Jesus. Even though scholars have been working on these problems for 300 years, most outsiders had never heard of them, let alone known that they mattered for anything. If textual criticism can be made interesting and relevant, anything in the field of biblical studies can be made interesting and relevant. And it should be. One of the major developments of the past 20 years or so is that biblical scholars have renewed an effort which was once more common before a very long and unfortunate hiatus of making the results of their scholarship more widely available to the non-professional reading public. One could argue that the recent big push to popularize biblical scholarship started with the Jesus Seminar. I'm not an enthusiastic fan of the seminar. I completely disagree with the conclusions that it has drawn about the historical Jesus up and down the line, and I think, okay, yeah, never mind, I'm going to skip that part. The seminar has opened up scholarly discussions to the wider public, which has realized to its surprise that it really is intrigued by what scholars are saying. The writings of several members of the seminar, especially Dom and Marcus Board, have reached hundreds of thousands of people who otherwise would have known nothing about biblical scholarship, and that's obviously all to the good. We as biblical scholars need to be informing the public about what we do. Many of us are public servants, supported by tax dollars of hardworking people in our broader communities. Those of us in that boat should not ignore these people. Moreover, all of us, state employees or not, are members of these communities, and we have a responsibility to them. But there are 2 points I want to stress about this move to make scholarship more widely available to the average person in the pew and on the street. This is not something that every scholar can do, and it's not something that every scholar should do. First, we may as well acknowledge not everyone can do it. Communicating scholarly knowledge to a popular audience is a real skill, and it does not come easy. In graduate school, all of us acquired the assumptions, ingested the massive background knowledge, and learned the jargon of our trade. In the process, most of us managed to forget that normal human beings, as opposed to abnormal scholars, do not know what we know or understand our way of thinking and talking. Writing for a popular audience means writing for people who may be highly intelligent but who know nothing about what we do and why we do it. Writing a book for the broader culture means knowing how to take incredibly textured, nuanced, and technical information and making it accessible to an intelligent outsider. This is not easy to do. If it were easy to do, everyone would do it. It takes an unbelievable amount of work, and most people can't do it. For anyone interested in giving it a go, let me stress the point. If you want to write a book for the Barnes & Noble crowd, you're not writing it for your colleagues in cognate fields, for seminarians, or for advanced undergraduates. You're writing it for your mother, and for the guy who lives across the street. They probably know nothing about what you're talking about. The trick is to communicate with them simply without oversimplifying, to speak to them intelligently without condescending. Many scholars who decide that they want to write for a broader audience think that they can write a kind of crossover book, one that scholars will be able to use, but that will communicate more broadly to a wider audience. This is wrong, wrong, wrong. You can't do both. You have to choose what you want to do. And it's all a question of your audience and your voice. You have to speak to your audience in terms that it understands and do so in a way that can help them follow what you have to say without acting like you're dumbing it down for the idiots on the outside. If you can do that, you should think about doing it. But I have a major proviso, which is my second point. Writing for a popular audience is not for everyone, and not everyone should try. In my view, that task and privilege should belong only to those who are recognized as bona fide scholars in the field. Presenting scholarship to a wider audience presupposes that you are an active scholar and are passionate about scholarship. We are scholars because of this passion, and we should never lose this passion. The reason we may want to reach a broader audience is precisely because of this passion, which drives our work and rules our lives. We want to share it with others, but to share it effectively with others, we need to keep it alive within ourselves, which means that no one who communicates with a broader audience should do so until they have satisfied the longings of their own passion. And if they decide to try to communicate with a broader audience, they should decidedly not stop pursuing their passion of scholarship itself. I do not think that junior scholars should try to write for the general public, and in fact that anyone should do so until they've established themselves as scholars in the field, not simply by regurgitating knowledge that others have worked hard to attain, but also by generating knowledge themselves. Over a period of years, in real, hard-hitting, technical work written for your fellow scholars. I regularly meet potential graduate students who want to get credentialed in the field by writing a quick dissertation so that they can go on then with what they perceive to be the real business at hand, writing popular books for a lay audience. In my opinion, this is wrong in all sorts of ways. Until a person has become a serious research scholar, she or he does not have the credentials to represent the rest of us to the reading public. It is precisely the premature move into the popular realm that leads to the gross oversimplifications of scholarship that you can find on the shelves of Barnes & Noble. Moreover, the reading public has the right to expect that a person who represents him or herself as a scholar really is a scholar. Not just was a scholar once, but is a scholar, producing scholarship still. I can be more specific. It's not enough to have written a dissertation. In my view, no one should try to write a popular book before having published 2 or 3 serious scholarly books in the field, and so establish their credentials as someone who has real breadth and depth as a scholar. This view is related to a very deep concern I have for where our field of biblical studies seems to be going, a view that possibly some of you share. The serious scholar is becoming a dinosaur. The generation before us was peopled by serious scholars who devoted their lives to scholarship, who spent years mastering a field and obtaining a real, hard-fought expertise before presenting their views to the world in rigorous, serious monographs. One of the biggest problems we have in our field today is that we are surrounded with too much generalized knowledge and far too little real expertise. We need to renew our commitment to the practice of developing technical, deep, and broad scholarship. Those of us who do write books for a broader public should be scholars who have done this kind of scholarship and continue to do so. Otherwise, we really are simply popularizers, promoting half-baked ideas and generalized information without the power and persuasion that comes from being a real expert in the field. In sum, I do indeed think that it is vitally important that we, as a society of scholars, make our scholarship available to the wider reading public. But it is equally, if not more, important that we protect and promote our first love, the passion of our scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bart. Our next speaker is the E. Rose and Leona B. Carpenter Professor of New Testament Studies and Professor of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School and College of Arts and Science in Nashville. She is also affiliated professor at the Center for the Study of Jewish-Christian Relations in Cambridge, UK. The author of multiple books, including The Misunderstood Jew and the newly published The Meaning of the Bible, co-authored with Douglas Knight. She is a self-described Yankee Jewish feminist and a member of Congregation Sheretz Israel, an Orthodox synagogue, although she is often quite unorthodox. Please welcome Amy Jo Levine.
Good Shabbos. I'm going to play by the rules. For the 15 minutes we've been allotted, I want to talk about what's new in biblical studies, the have we moved beyond Jesus' divinity question, the conservative-liberal divide in churches, and the difference scholars can make. What's new? 200 years ago, a Jewish woman, or a Jew, or a woman participating in a public discussion of the Bible would have been a tad odd. That I be here with a laicized priest and a public agnostic makes this even more odd. Tom would still have been here, but you'd have different neckwear, I suspect. Which means the guilt has expanded in terms of gender, class, confession, ethnicity, nationality, physical ability, explicit sexual orientation, and so on. But the expansion has not, in general, changed the popular image of Jesus. He's still the hero who stands over against rather than speaks from within his tradition. He's still unique, which is a theological category. He still represents everything that's right. It's Matthew that got it wrong. And so he is still perfect, or if you prefer, God on earth. In other words, despite over 2 centuries of the attempt to locate Jesus in his Jewish context, the older views of a Jesus whose relation to Judaism, however defined, was either to critique it or to rise above it, predominates in Christian settings, even in churches that have been, well, saving Jesus or living the questions or even reading the Bible again for the first time. The distinction is, I think, theologically necessary, especially for liberal Protestants who are strangely missing from this panel. Prior to historical criticism, Jesus was for Christians distinct by definition. His mother was a virgin at his conception, if not also at his birth. The miraculous feedings were more than just people sharing lunch. His death redeemed humanity from sin and guaranteed eternal life. He rose after being really dead, and he ascended into the sky whence he will return. He was unique. Then came the historical critical approach. If we call it Religionswissenschaft, it sounds so much better, with its questioning of dogmatics and its questioning of supernaturalism. But here's the problem. The liberal Christian needed to keep him unique in order to justify their Christianity. And the easiest way to do this was to make him the only Jew who cared about justice, spirit, compassion, the poor, and anything else worth caring about. Today, this unique acontextual Jesus is the one who, in popular imagination, replaces the Jewish purity system with his system of compassion, who combats the temple domination system. I've taken to calling this the TDS, because it sounds like a venereal disease, and who operates as a feminist within a Judaism that makes the Taliban look progressive. If Jesus preaches good news to the poor, so the popular impression goes, the Jews must be preaching good news to the rich. If he welcomes sinners, so the Jews must be pushing them away. And if he's the pedagogue of the oppressed, then Judaism must be the oppressor. Most commentary today about Jesus speaks of Jesus' ministry to the marginal and outcast. I am tempted at this meeting, every time I hear the word marginal or outcast, to call out bingo. And I think we all might want to try that. It might make things more interesting. Rarely asked, however, are questions like, cast out from what? Cast out by whom? Marginal to what? So the congregation gets the point that the Jews have made outcasts of, the poor, women, Gentiles, Samaritans, the blind, the lame, the deaf, the demon-possessed Galileans, and pretty much everybody except for, the Jews. A version of this approach appears also in some social science study. The divide posited between law-based, elitist, urban, temple-oriented, and, Jewish Judea, and marginal, charismatic, non-hierarchical, rural, and, low-church Protestant Galilee separates Jesus from what readers generally think of as Jewish, and the separation is then reinforced by those who want to translate the Greek term Judaios as Judean rather than Jew, who state we cannot talk about Jews until after the Talmud, and who go on to note that Jesus wasn't even a Judean but a Galilean, and so they strip Jesus of anything resembling what we would call Judaism. How popular are these negative constructs? The great theologian, President Jimmy Carter, in his Bible studies actually compares early Judaism to the Taliban, and the World Council of Churches publishes comments such as the following, quote, Jesus' crucifixion marked the temporal triumph of the patriarchal God of Judaism. The God of the clan will sanctify anything including militarism, war, sexism, apartheid, as long as it serves the interests of the clan. So bravo, Dominic. If the World Council of Churches had a decent theology of the Christian Bible, we wouldn't have stuff like this. At most, any positive locating of Jesus in his Jewish context is recognizing that Jesus, like the prophets of Israel, were concerned about justice. That's right. But anything specifically Jewish about Jesus, his observance of halakha, Jewish ritual practice, for example, gets erased. Upshot, 200 years of historical critical work, and we still have, generally speaking, a unique Jesus constructed in our, your image, and divorced from his Jewish context, with that context negatively described to promote a Jesus who addresses today's social concerns. Well-gazing continues plus ça change. nor are we any closer to clear source critical work. James Barker has just completed a superb dissertation making a credible case for John's use of Matthew, and John's Gospel is increasingly being used in historical Jesus studies. Rabbinic sources are now back in play. The synoptic problem is again open for discussion. We don't know if the Dead Sea Scrolls represent sectarian particularity or general views. We don't know what's tradition and what's redaction. And we're all still engaged in that dirty little game of mirror reading. We read the gospel, we determine the author and community on the basis of the context, and then we interpret the text on the basis of the hypothetical author and audience. Plus ça change. On the question, have we moved beyond divinity questions concerning Jesus to address issues of primary concern to New Testament writers? I think the question is poorly phrased, because Jesus' divinity is of primary concern to the New Testament writers. That's why they talk about the Word being made flesh and Jesus as being in divine form and is sitting at the right hand of the Father. The question of Jesus' divinity is not marginal to the New Testament. The problem is that too many folks stop at the assertion Jesus is divine. The New Testament writers were concerned with more than that. They were concerned with what kind of divinity he was. Perhaps if we got beyond the was he or wasn't he to if you think that he was, then what does that say about your ethics and your theology? We'd have a better bridge across the liberal-conservative church divide, and perhaps if we recognized a much more fluid view of the divine in early Judaism, we'd have a better bridge between church and synagogue. Regarding that liberal-conservative divide and the claim that it has polarized conversation in both academic and popular circles and created two discrete audiences where one side doesn't read the work of the other, I'd rephrase that as well. I am on most Sundays and Wednesdays in churches. Friday night I should be in the synagogue, but there was this other invitation. If I could do programs for Southern Baptist and Churches of Christ, as well as for Unitarian mainline Protestants, Anglicans, and Roman Catholics, including the Italian Bishops' Conference, and 2 weeks ago in Alabama, I did a One Nation Under God prayer breakfast. The divide is not that severe. Granted, I may have an easier time than my Christian colleagues, since I'm not expected to toe the particular Christian party line. As my mother once put it, it's easier to be an infidel than an apostate. Infidels are usually expelled, apostates are tortured and killed. Nevertheless, what is reaching rapprochement in some settings is still marked by a divide in others. And we need to recognize, we who do religion for a business need to recognize that dangers are still there. Faculty to this day are still being fired because they question the Bible's historical credibility, and we need to stand up for these folks. The four of us on this panel have a certain luxury, given our academic affiliation in a public institution, our religion, our Christianity, or the blessedness of retirement. The foundation for the bridges across the conservative-liberal divide is already there, although bashing on both sides continues. From conservative stereotyping of the Jesus Seminar and of Bart as atheistic elitists, which means Bart and the seminar get put in the same group, it can happen, to liberal stereotyping of some evangelicals as fundamentalist troglodytes. But that doesn't have to be the case. Conversation does occur. In the SBL last year, in a session sponsored by the Historical Jesus Committee, Bob Miller makes me look like an evangelical. Bob Miller and I responded to papers by 3 in the confessional camp, and the event was remarkably congenial. Then again, perhaps we talked past each other. Conservative Christian scholars are now using the criteria of authenticity, a move that 20 years ago would have been anathema. Not surprisingly, application of the criteria when they use them inevitably leaves positive results, thus proving the gospel to be true. And this innovation in evangelical scholarship comes at a time when many of us who are not evangelicals have concluded the criteria to be fatally flawed. A flaw demonstrated by the fact that after over half a century, we're no closer to the consensus on Jesus than we were when we started. Finally, on the question, do these current trends in scholarship address the concerns of people outside of the academy? Where do you see scholars making a difference in helping people in the pews better understand the Bible? Speaking to the community through books and lectures is nothing new. Bible talks have been going on as long as there have been Bibles. Do scholars make a difference? Of course. Our publications and those of our colleagues, the various mysteries of the Bible, the inevitable magazine features for Christmas and Easter and so on, continue to interest people. The move from the ivory tower to the street and from the North Atlantic to the global place of biblical studies has enfranchised myriads. But there's more to do. 3 points. First, the biblical studies classroom is not necessarily conducive to helping or even interesting most laity. The what of the historical critical approach needs for seminarians and divinity students to be connected to the so what of the ecclesial community. But the connection is usually left to the student, who often finds that in the pulpit old stereotypes of good Jesus versus bad Jews work better than the nuances of history. Nor do sermons on JEDP, Q1, Q2, Q3, LM, or John's appendix, which is not the wound in Jesus' side, look right in church bulletins. I think more biblical studies faculty should spend time in churches and in conversation with laity, and if we did, we'd all be better off. Second, with the expansion of the Biblical Studies Guild and the attendant introduction of new reading strategies, history is increasingly taking a back seat. The focus today is on the meaning in front of the text, a focus that flattens all history, and the extreme view is that the historical critical approach is Western, which is in the academy a bad thing, unless you're in the AAR, hegemonic, elitist, or otherwise completely compromised. Granted, much early historical critical work was subjective mapping of the scholar's agenda onto ancient texts. But today's students know the critique of historical criticism without being aware of the benefits of doing history. Instead, we encourage our students to read from their social location, which is fine, but if that's all they do, the work threatens to become either solipsistic or a celebration of victimization. Doing history at least treated with respect the idea that those early followers of Jesus had something specific to report. And those of us who take the Bible seriously and take history seriously can provide a corrective to the current popular wave of solipsistic biblical studies. Third, what can be done by biblical scholars in addition to paying more attention to what's going on in the pews, and in addition to helping students integrate the what it might have meant question to the what it might mean question? All four of us do public talks. We're all more or less on the same circuit, although I suspect I've done more synagogue programs than my colleagues, and I'm pretty sure I've done more programs on affirming gay and lesbian congregants and talking about the Bible and sexuality. The sort of things we do depend on our investments. Here are some things I've been doing. I talk to gay and lesbian youth to show them that the Bible need not be only as a rock thrown to do damage, but it can be a rock on which they stand, to help them see diverse ways problematic texts have been interpreted, and to insist on the value of who they are as God's divine creatures. I do programs for divinity students and seminarians on how to avoid anti-Jewish preaching. I do this because the American Association of Theological Schools refuses to put such programs into their guidelines, because most seminary professors in the New Testament don't read enough homiletics to know the pitfalls, and do not spend enough time talking to congregations about their stereotypes. And finally, I work as a consultant for Americans for Peace Now, Churches for Middle East Peace, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, with a focus on helping Christians promote peace in Israel and Palestine without making their case based on anti-Jewish exegesis or supersessionist theology. In other words, biblical studies has always been used to talk about public issues and not just personal spirituality. But today the terms of the conversation have changed because the public issues have changed. And that, I think, is a good thing. So where are we? And are we better than where we were 2 centuries ago? Sure. Because of the work of biblical scholars, people who have doubts about the historicity of both testaments can more safely raise their questions. The Guild has expanded, and with expansion comes new questions, new reading strategies, corrections, and refinements, and that's all to the good. We are more cognizant today that certain interpretations cause harm. We are more alert to what we don't know, and we are more aware of our tendencies to impose our own concerns onto the work. And in cases too numerous to count, we have all heard from people in the pew, thank you for raising the questions, for providing us the tools to study on our own, and for taking the questions of history seriously. And that's all to the good. Thank you.
Our final presenter is the former Bishop of Durham in the Church of England and is now serving as the Chair of New Testament and Early Christianity at the School of Divinity at the University of St. Andrews. For 20 years, he taught New Testament studies at Cambridge, McGill, and Oxford universities. He is the award-winning author of After You Believe, Surprised by Hope, Simply Christian, and the newly published Simply Jesus and the Kingdom New Testament. His next book, How God Became King, will be published this coming spring. Please welcome N.T. Wright.
Thank you. I saw in my dream 4 horsemen emerge from the great western city and gallop off to colonize the world. The first horseman carried a scroll of Lucretius, which he found in 1417, which removed the angry and dangerous God from the world, enabling people to live without fear of wrath or death. The second horseman carried in his hand the letters of Paul, through which in 1517 he claimed he'd rediscovered the gospel, enabling people to see that Jesus' cross, appropriated by faith, enabled one to live without fear of wrath or death. There was then a pause during which other horsemen pursued the first 2, trying to quell their subversive messages and re-establish the power of the great western city. But then the third horseman emerged with 2 saddlebags labelled Thesis and Antithesis, and on his back a further bag labelled Synthesis. And he, with encouragement from his friends in Paris, Edinburgh, and Königsberg, enabled many to escape their previous unenlightened and superstitious lives and enter a brave new world in which the inner dialectic of history could at last be understood. Finally, there emerged a rider who launched the apocalyptic 20th century with his own apocalyptic vision of a God who breaks into the world with healing and music and history. Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and Revolution. These bestride our narrow world like so many colossuses, and myriads of us walk under their huge legs and peep about to try to make sense of the Bible, Western culture, and Christian life and work. Now, it might be fun to continue in this vein, but you get the point. It's impossible to understand the last 2 centuries of biblical scholarship without seeing this larger picture. The rediscovery of Lucretius by Poggio Bracciolini was a major launching moment not only for the Renaissance, emerging after generations of supposed tyranny under the stern eye of God and the Pope, but also for many other men and movements, including such disparate figures as Machiavelli and your own dear Thomas Jefferson. To this day, arguably, most Westerners live in an assumed Epicurean world, with a distant and remote divinity and a world which evolves under its own steam, sustaining both Darwinism and social democracy. What is often hailed as the rise of historical consciousness in the 18th century, producing the early moments in the quest for Jesus and some other bits of the New Testament, was in fact the application of Epicurean philosophy of a deistic world from which an interfering God was removed by definition to the study of the past. Many continuing debates to this day are shaped by the to and fro within this assumed Epicurean view. Does this distant God intervene or doesn't he? And whenever, for instance, we discuss miracle, the discussion collapses into an either-or. Either an interventionist deism, which good post-Hume Epicureans know is a category mistake, or the cleaner and clearer non-interventionist deism. This larger framework has conditioned and distorted New Testament scholarship to this day. There are other ways to think about who God might be and how this God might act in the world. Jewish ones, for instance. The second horseman, obviously, is Martin Luther. Most New Testament scholarship until recently came from German Lutherans. Part of the energy of the German Enlightenment was a kind of Lutheranism manqué. Here was a way not only of dismissing works righteousness, but of separating out God and the world, faith and ordinary life altogether. And the older Lutheran two kingdoms theology found a fresh philosophical framework which most biblical scholars until recently took for granted. The early Christians were thinking of a spiritual salvation, not a worldly one. One obvious malign consequence of this had to do with the 19th century German assessment of Judaism. First, it was a religion, but second, it was the wrong sort of religion. A second consequence, now undermined but still powerful, was F.C. Bauer's division of early Christianity into the quite spurious categories of Jewish Christianity, Gentile Christianity, enthusiasts, and early Catholics. This has produced lingering prejudices. The rejection of Ephesians and Colossians still functions as a litmus test of true Pauline scholarship long after its ideological base has been removed. Some, as we have heard, have invented new bases conveniently for the same result. The irony is that many readers have taken these ideologically driven constructs and supposed them to be unvarnished facts, to be taught, along with such things as the still hypothetical dates for the Gospels, to unsuspecting seminarians as the assured results of modern criticism, as you've already heard from A.J., as if. Meanwhile, another factor has been hugely influential, though largely ignored. The brain scientist Ian McGilchrist has recently argued that the left brain, right brain split, in which the right brain should lead the way and give the big picture while the left brain sorts out the details, has malfunctioned at a cultural level in parallel to what happens in schizophrenia. The Western world, since the Enlightenment, he argues, has allowed left brain thinking not only to usurp the proper leadership of the right, but actually to oust it and ignore it altogether, imagining one can construe and convey the complex, many-sided reality of life in lists and statistics, supposing this to be somehow scientific, while right brain activities such as music, narrative, poetry, or faith are less scientific, and so to be relegated to the margins or discarded altogether. Brain scientists no doubt continue to debate the precise cortical analysis, but anyone who knows modern biblical studies will see the point. Think of the synoptic problem for a start. Just as an aside, when Vincent Taylor, that great Methodist synoptic critic, was brought into a parish in Leeds during the war because the regular pastor was away on military chaplaincy duties, he ran the parish all right during the war. After the war, a Methodist minister who wasn't retired was put in as the regular Methodist minister, and he asked the parish what they wanted to do with their midweek Bible studies. They said, "We don't much care what we do as long as it isn't that their synoptic problem." Vincent Taylor had spent the war while Leeds was being bombed, teaching them about Proto-Luke and early forms of Q, goodness knows what. It's far easier to get a biblical studies PhD by the use of the left brain alone, analysing texts into smaller and smaller fragments, than to deal with other dimensions of complex texts. Such people often then obtain teaching posts, and would-be clergy are treated to left-brain biblical studies which bear little relation to the reason they entered seminary in the first place, or the sermons they want to preach when they leave. Sometimes, of course, such left-brain studies are yoked unequally with an unthought-out big picture which consists simply of the professor's own undigested prejudices of whichever sort. Neither church nor academy is well served by this unhappy spectacle. One person who did see the big picture and decided to live by it was my fourth horseman, Albert Schweitzer. His apocalyptic vision offered a Christianized version of Nietzsche, interestingly, which suited the mood of the times rather well. That may be why his influence was then firmly squelched, with the rise of Bart and Bultmann after the First World War, addressing Germany's urgent questions with the revisionist reading of Romans, Bart, and the classic left-brain analysis of gospel forms, Bultmann. Schweitzer's program came back with a bang through the work of Kaiserman, though Kaiserman didn't actually admit it. In a further radical mutation, it presents itself in the historically dubious so-called apocalyptic readings of Paul, currently fashionable here in America, which reconnect also with Bart, just at the point where, in my view, Bart was weakest. Major agendas there. One more bit of unhelpful framework, and then three interlocking hopeful signs. First, The main focus of Western biblical scholarship has now rather obviously shifted to the United States, much to the chagrin of our German colleagues. This has brought great energy, but also great dangers. It's now all too easy to screen out not only third world writers, we've always done that, why? Who knows, but also non-English speaking writers, and to conduct research on the analogy of that sporting competition, which, though it's called the World Series, actually only involves Americans. Worse, we have swapped the framing concerns of neo-Kantian Lutherans for the framing concerns of a deeply divided America, in which the old battle lines of the Civil War on the one hand, and the massive and damaging fundamentalist modernist controversy on the other, provide a sharply etched grid through which all of reality is perceived. It ought not to be the case, but it sadly is, that if you find an American who believes that Jesus is the divine Son of God, sent to die for our sins and take us back with him to heaven, and if you meet another American who believes that Jesus was a goodish man and taught some goodish things but didn't think he was divine or a saviour and didn't rise from the dead, you can almost guarantee, not quite, but almost, which way they're going to vote in the next election. Here we see a strange mixture of Enlightenment Epicureanism and postmodern political posturing which corrodes both church life and the writing of biblical commentaries. However, there was such a thing as history before Enlightenment rationalistic reductionism, and history can still flourish, challenging all our ideological constructs. It's fitting that the move back to genuine history, as opposed to what called itself the historical critical method, whose history as well as whose criticism was basically ideologically driven, has come not least through the massive work on Second Temple Judaism, fueled as much by post-Holocaust reaction, perhaps guilt, as by the discovery of the scrolls and such things. And with history, and especially Jewish history, there have come several other wonderful things which Epicureanism, Lutheranism, and left-brain detail-mongering had screened out. The centrality of biblical narrative, the importance of inner biblical allusion and echo, and not least the political dimension. The latter, of course, has itself been driven in part by the usual American polarization, but at its best it grows out of the historical fact that Second Temple Jews saw the kingdom of God not as snatching people away from the kingdoms of the world, but as overcoming the world with a radically different kind of power. And with that refreshed and essentially Jewish perception, as I take it to be, the way is open for the New Testament to be reread, both in the academy and in the church, as the story of a strange quasi-messianic figure who announced that God was then and there becoming king, and who went to his death in obedience to a scripture-soaked vocation to fulfill Israel's purpose of bringing the light of the Creator God to the kingdoms of the world. Interestingly, the great Western city itself, following at snail-like pace the impetus of its own Vatican II, has begun to take a serious part in this new work. And once we realize that the now traditional squabbles about miracles should be relocated away from the false polarizations of Enlightenment Epicureanism, we might be free to think differently and perhaps Jewishly, both about how the Creator God and the world relate to one another, and about the sharp questions of why and how early Christianity began. Likewise, once we reread the Gospels in this light, to come to another of the questions we were asked, we move beyond the question of whether Jesus was or wasn't divine, do we put a check in this box or that box, to the more dangerous question of how through Jesus God was establishing his kingdom and what that kingdom might look like. Both orthodoxy and unorthodoxy have for too long sheltered behind their own safe question and avoided the real danger of theocracy radically reworked around Jesus and his cross. Perhaps the most telling sign of the times is that whereas 40 years ago nobody bothered much about the temple and its significance, it is now regularly seen as central. That's a massive advance. The temple confronts the world of Epicureanism and its offshoots with the news that God's world and our world are not far apart. They overlap and interlock. The Jewish claim that this vision is freshly instantiated in the study of Torah, and the Christian claim that the Word tabernacled in our midst and we beheld his glory, are close cousins, something that my second and third horsemen resisted tooth and nail, but which my fourth saw and embraced. The delicacy of that relationship should not distract attention from the radical difference between those two positions and the non-Jewish, non-narratival, split-world rationalism, both of radical Western Protestantism and of conservative Western Protestantism. Like the Hindu in Belfast, who was asked whether he was a Catholic Hindu or a Protestant Hindu, those of us who follow this fresh reading of the New Testament want to say to our critics right and left, don't imagine that because we don't check all your fundamentalist boxes, we must be modernists, or that because we don't check all your modernist boxes, we must be fundamentalists. Only when we understand the roots of our present polarizations in distorted Western medieval questions and the distorted answers they have received, can we pursue the genuine historical inquiry which will refresh not only the Academy, but, please God, the life and witness of the Church. Thank you.